in my view, maximizing shareholder value is a little bit like going to sleep. If you're having trouble sleeping, the solution is not to lie in bed and say, I'm going to figure out how to sleep. It's to do something else. And I think John is right. What companies need to do is think about making their business as effective as possible. Warren Buffett has often said, you create a great business by watching what's going on the field, not keeping your eye on the scoreboard. Because the market may get things right, may get things wrong. You really shouldn't pay attention. You should do what Jeff Bezos does. And I think what John agreed to is do what you have to do to make a great business. And eventually, a relatively efficient market will recognize you if you're successful in that effort.
Guido.
I just want to highlight a point that I made already. I think efficiency is not the only issue for companies, and markets are not the only criterion they have to take into consideration when they make decisions, because they have to be perceived as legitimate. If they are not perceived as legitimate, they will run into all kinds of limitations of what they can do. Just look at the tobacco industry. Their legitimacy is perceived as very, very low. And in return for that, they are limited in what they can do by a lot of laws that other industries do not have. A lack of legitimacy makes you less efficient, creates costs. And that is a purely ethical thing. It's how you are perceived in how you do things. Is it perceived as appropriate or not? So this is something, if you don't keep it in mind when you make decisions, you create, paradoxically, profit problems. So you have to manage efficiency, profit, but also legitimacy.
Well, I think Guido's made a very important point there, which is what has happened. And it's to some degree directly attributable to the Friedman doctrine, is to undermine the legitimacy of business in the eyes of the public. We have this paradox at the moment that Google and Facebook each have 2 billion customers each. That's more than anyone has imagined any business having in the history of the world. And yet I can read every day an article slagging off Google and Facebook. We're in this world where we love the products, but we hate the producers. And there's something very wrong with that. And what business ought to be saying is not the social responsibility of the business is to maximize its profits. It's saying the social responsibility of business is to make the contribution which business can make to the community, which is producing goods and services that people want. It's providing good returns to investors. It's providing satisfying employment for the people who work there. It's making a proper contribution through corporate taxation to the other activities of the community. That's what responsible business, in my book, is about and for. Right. And business has presented a description of itself. And Friedman takes a lot of responsibility for this description of itself, which is both repellent and false as a description of how good business actually operates.
I could make an entirely opposite argument for the deterioration of trust in businesses, though, which is that rather than kind of a focus on profits, I think you'll find that most of these large Silicon Valley tech giants are very much focused on their social responsibility, certainly in their outward pronouncements. I mean, I think Google when it listed its corporate motto as "Do no evil," and these places are full of what they call social justice warriors these days. It's deep within their culture to take social responsibility very seriously, and yet trust in these organizations is falling and falling. And so you could take the opposite view and say that people just don't buy it. And they just don't see a real world link between what these companies say and what they do. John, if you could just come back, and then Joanne.
Yeah, and that's not very surprising. One of the most incredible things happening at the moment is, I don't know whether anyone on this Zoom has followed the case of, it's a class action led by Arkansas teachers against Goldman Sachs. And the basis of the class action is that Goldman Sachs' ethics statement said, and still does say, our clients' interests always come first. Now, the case being brought by Arkansas teachers and others is that essentially they were misled by this statement into thinking this was a respectable company which would be a rewarding investment for Arkansas teachers and others. The defense which is being put up to this, and don't get me wrong, it's the defense, is to say that actually is to provide a list of over 30 occasions on which conflicts of interest within Goldman Sachs were reported adversely in the papers. It's the defense which is producing this list of things in order to argue that the revelations that Goldman Sachs did not follow its ethics statement was well-known public information, that market participants didn't take the statement seriously. And it's what is in legal terms called a mere puff. And the US Chamber of Commerce has actually weighed in with an amicus curiae brief in defense of Goldman Sachs, which says all companies make statements like integrity and honesty are at the heart of our business. And they say this actually almost defies belief, that if the case against Goldman were to succeed, companies would in future make these statements at their peril. Well, they should make them at their peril. They should make them at their peril. And the way of dealing with it is not to say that these things are mere puffs, like Red Bull gives you wings, or Heineken refreshes the parts other beers cannot reach, which is what they are claiming. It is to say that these statements ought to be true about the business, and people ought not to make them if they're not true. And if they're not true, they probably ought not to be in business very long. But that's what I mean by saying business has presented itself as being both repellent and false. And that's why people do not want business near their hospitals, their schools, and indeed their water supply and their electricity.
So you see, Joanne, inflation is a problem.
Sorry?
Inflation is a problem, just a different kind. Joanne, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, just to comment on that, there's another way to look at your question. And one of the reasons why people don't like these companies is not only the size, it's not their social responsibility statements alone, but it's also the mere size and wealth of these companies in a time of growing inequality. So I think there are social reasons why everybody's getting very nervous about these large companies, as well as, of course, some of the political reasons, certainly in the US, that these companies are impinging on things like our privacy and other things. But I'm glad that John brought up the Goldman case, because that is amusing. And I think every company on Wall Street is probably looking at their ethics statement to see if they can live up to it. And, you know, it is a lesson to learn. I did a case study, a Harvard case study many years ago of a company that had their ethics codes on these beautiful big wall posters all over. It was a manufacturing concern. And it started with our employees come first. And as soon as I finished writing the case study, they shipped 500 jobs overseas. So, you know, the question is what is our understanding of what companies say to people?